Chapter 7. Fred Snodgrass. Often I have been asked to tell what I did to Fred Snodgrass after he dropped that fly ball in the World Series in 1912, 11 years ago. Well, I will tell you exactly what I did. I raised his salary $1,000. John McGraw, my 30 years in baseball. Sorry. I look back at my years in baseball without a tremendous amount of pleasure. Yes, I'd love to do it all over again, and that's spite of the fact that I'd had what might be called a rather stormy career in baseball. For over half a century, I've had to live with the fact that I dropped a ball in a World Series. Oh, yes, you're the guy that dropped that fly ball, aren't you? And for years and years, whenever I'd be introduced to somebody that it'd start to say something and then stop, afraid of hurting my feelings. But nevertheless, those were wonderful years, and if I had the chance, I'd gladly do it all over again, every bit of it. Of course, playing baseball was more than just fun. For a youngster, it was quite an education, too. Especially, it was an education to play under John J. McGraw. He was a great man, really a wonderful fellow, and a great manager to play for. Naturally, McGraw and I didn't always see things alike. I was a headstrong, quick-tempered 20-year-old kid. When I joined the Giants in 1908, sometimes McGraw would bawl the dickens out of me, as he did everybody else. Any mental error, my failure to think, and McGraw would be all over you, and I do believe he had the most vicious tongue of any man who ever lived. Absolutely. Sometimes that wasn't very easy to take, However, he'd never get on you for a mechanical mistake. A fielding error or failure to get a hit, he was a very fair man. It was only when you really had it coming to you that you got it. And once he'd balled you out good and proper, and I do mean proper, then he'd forget it. He wouldn't ever mention it again, and in public, he would always stand up for his players. It was really a lot of fun to play for McGraw. As a matter of fact, it was because Mr. McGraw's favorite form of relaxation was watching the ponies that I became a professional ball player in the first place. He loved to follow the horses, and in February 1908, he came out here to Los Angeles, California to attend the races. He didn't bring his team. He was out here by himself. While he was here, he'd put on a uniform and work to get himself in shape before spring training began, so he could to get the jump on all those old-timers who were on the Giants then. At the time, the only contact I had with baseball was playing Sundays on a semi-pro team called the Oogie Flags. We were sponsored by a sporting goods house, and our backs we had flags of all nations. We played teams all over Southern California, and I still remember the one, and that was toughest. It was a team down by Santa Ana, over which Walter Johnson pitched. Or for which Walter Johnson pitched for. If people think Walter was fast later on, they should have seen him then. Whew! Most of the time you couldn't even see the ball. Anyway, one of my friends was helping McGraw work out at the ballpark, shagging flies for him and things like that. McGraw asked a question about me, remembering, I guess, that the year before the Giants had played 3 exhibition games at St. Vincent's College in Los Angeles, and as a student there, I had caught for St. Vincent's. Mr. McGraw had been the umpire, and we had argued and quarreled constantly all through those 3 games. Oh, Snodgrass is the best catcher in semi-pro around here, my friend said. Well, McGraw said, if you see him, tell him I'd like to talk to him. Word got to me. I discussed it with my parents. There didn't seem to be any harm in talking to him, so I called him up at his hotel. He asked me to meet him in the lobby the next day, which I did. Are you thinking about playing baseball? McGraw asked me. A little bit, I said, but not too seriously, although I did have an offer from Peoria in the 3I League. He reached into his pocket and said, "Here's a contract. Take it home and talk it over with your father and mother. If they think you ought to try baseball or train leaves for spring training in 4 days. Let me know what you decide, will you?" Well, as you can imagine, 4 days later, I was on a train going to Marlin, Texas. That's the way I got started in baseball. Of course, my contract only called for $150 a month. And to tell the truth, at the time, I couldn't even name all the clubs in the big leagues. But suddenly, I was there at spring training with the New York Giants. You see, in those days, they didn't have any army of coaches and scouts and things of that kind. The way they got young players was by direct observation themselves. Or some friend of the club would tip off John McGraw or other managers, and here was a likely kid, and they would bring him up and look him over. The Giants had bought a piece of property in Marlin, Texas, a town of about 4,000 to 5,000 people, and had constructed a ballpark there for spring training purposes. They thought that in a little town like that, they would keep the fellows under control better. The ballpark was about 2 miles from our hotel, and every day, twice a day, morning and afternoon, we walked from the hotel to the ballpark along some railroad tracks that ran close by. We trained there every spring. I was with the Giants until 1915. Of course, spring training was very different in those days compared to today. It was simpler and it was tougher. Today, you have specialized teachers, coaches, and schools, and blackboards, and all that sort of thing. You have mass calisthenics and medical pictures and moving pictures to look at to see what you're doing wrong. And a host of other things. Maybe it's helpful and maybe it isn't. I guess it must be. We didn't have any of those things then. We didn't have 10 coaches, each a professional teacher in some aspect of baseball, who was a fine fellow, but who was probably the worst third base coach who ever lived. They didn't make a specialty of such things then. In those days, you see it was strictly up to the individual to improve himself and to get himself into condition. If he was intelligent and if he was a man and a man who wanted to make the team, and because a first-class baseball player, or he himself had to leave. He had to have it in his heart to work at it. He wasn't made to do those things. In fact, he wasn't even encouraged very much. Of course, we trotted to and from the park every day, and McGraw insisted that we ran so many times around the park, and naturally we'd have batting and fielding practice. However, it was practically impossible for a youngster, a rookie, to get up to the plate in batting practice. For a youngster, a younger was an outsider, and those old veterans weren't about to make it easy for him to take away one of their jobs. Their Giants then had mostly rough and tough old characters, men who had been in around in quite a while, men like Mike Donlin, Joe McGinnity, Cy Seymour, or Spike Shannon, and a lot of others. When I came up in 1908, it was mostly team of veterans, and a lot of them nearing the end of their baseball careers, but that didn't mean they accepted the fact. And yet, when I looked back, I realized that I owe a great deal to one of those veterans. I was assigned in a room with Spike Shannon. He was about 30 years old, and I had been an outfielder in the big leagues for about 5 years. He took me under his wing, helped me, encouraged me, and told me what to do and what not to do. I doubted if I had ever made the club that year if it hadn't been for Shannon. But I did make it. I was the third-string catcher in 1908 behind Roger Breshanen and Tom Needham. I was sitting on the bench all through that season. That was the year of the famous Merkel incident when we should have won the pennant but didn't. In 1909, I was still the third-string catcher until the last month of the season, when McGraw put me in the outfield for about 20 games. Help. In 1910, I was a catcher again in spring training when the season opened. I was once more spending most of my time sitting on the bench. By then, Breshanen had left and Chief Myers was doing most of the catching. Then on the first road trip of 1910, McGraw came to me in the hotel. We were playing Cincinnati. "Snow," he said, "how would you like to play center field?" Well, I had been very unhappy sitting on the bench, and I immediately thought he was going to send me out to some minor league club. So I said, with what club?" "Why, this club, of course." "You mean you're going to take Cy Seymour out of center field?" "Yes," he said. "Would you like to try it?" So from then on, I was the regular center fielder for the Giants. I never went back to catching. I was also the substitute first baseman for Fred Ed Merkel. Whenever something happened and Merkel couldn't play, as a matter of fact, I preferred playing first base. I didn't particularly like the outfield. You can be out there all day without a chance, or maybe just backing up some play. I like to be in the middle of things and fight a little bit. That was quite a team we had in those days, as you know. We won the pennant in 11, 12, and 13. Fred Merkel was at first base, Larry Doyle at second, Al Bridwell, and then Art Fletcher at short. Art Devlin or Buck Herzog at third. In the outfield, Red Murray was on one side of me, Josh DeVore or George Burns on the other. The batter was Chief Myers. The battery was Chief Myers behind the plate, and Mathewson, Rube Marquardt, Jeff Teshero, Leon Ames, Hook Wiltz, Otis Crandall, or Bugs Raymond pitching. What a club that was. And this is going to be a very long chapter. Kill me. Marquardt was a great record Rube. In 1912, he won 19 straight almost. He won a complete game, and I still remember that wonderful 21-inning game he pitched against Pittsburgh. I think it was 1914. We won that game 3-1 in 21 innings. Rube pitched the whole game. As a matter of fact, I think Babe Adams pitched all 21 innings for Pittsburgh, too. You know, in those days, pitchers were expected to pitch the whole game. Today, it's entirely different. 5 or 6 pitchers a game isn't all unusual now, but then it was a disgrace if a pitcher didn't finish what he started. And Mathewson, the great pitcher that he was, he pitched a complete game almost every time he went out there. Matty was the greatest pitcher who ever lived, in my opinion. He was a wonderful, wonderful man, too. A reserved sort of fellow, a little hard to get close to. But once you got to know him, he was a truly good friend. Matty could do everything well. He was a checker champion in half a dozen states. He'd play several opponents simultaneously and beat them all. A good billiard player, a pretty good golfer, a terrific poker player. He made a good part of expenses every year playing poker. He was a good bridge player, too. And do you know that he never pitched on Sunday or even dressed in uniform? Of course, in those days, we never played Sunday ball in the East Coast, New York, Philadelphia, Boston, or Pittsburgh. Although, if we went to Chicago or Cincinnati or St. Louis, as we would, but Matty never would. I'm not saying that he was a very religious man, but he got started that way. I guess because of some belief he had, he continued it throughout his career. For contrast, we also had Bugs Raymond. Bugs drank too much and came into an early tragic end, but he was a sobber, and sometimes when he wasn't, and he was one of the greatest spitball pitchers who ever lived. McGraw tried to help him, but he didn't succeed. He tried at finding him when he would break training, but finding Bugs didn't have any effect. Bugs would go into the bar, pull a baseball out of his pocket, and autograph it, and he'd give it all the free drinks he wanted. Actually, McGraw didn't keep the fines. He would send the money to Bugs' wife, although he'd never let Bugs know this. Even when he wasn't drinking, Bugs did the strangest things. I remember once in spring training, we went to a fish fry on the final day before leaving camp. Somebody brought along a couple of target guns, and we were all shooting at targets. Bugs said, "Here, hit this." And he took out his pocket watch, and a very good watch that had been given to him in the minor leagues, I remember. Al Bredwell was shooting at the time. Bugs threw the watch up in the air, and Al put a bullet right through the middle of it. On the way back to New York that spring, we stopped for 3 days at Belvedere Hotel in Baltimore. The Belvedere was one of the finest hotels in the East Coast then, and they just about tripled our eating allowance there because it was so expensive. Bugs was never seen by anybody all 3 days we were there. On the morning we were to leave for New York, we were all down in the lobby, reading the newspapers and waiting to go, when somebody saw 2 waiters and 2 bus boys going into the elevators, all with loaded trays. It turned out to be Bugs Raymond's breakfast. Bugs hadn't eaten at the hotel for 3 days, and sure enough, he hadn't taken the menu and figured out exactly the amount he could spend item by item. He spent the whole 3 days meal allowance for that breakfast, and of course he was too much under the weather to eat any part of it. Bugs had a good sense of humor and was a lot of fun, but he couldn't stay away from drinking, and as a result, you could never be sure he'd show up. McGraw tried bringing his wife and children in along with the team, but both at home and on the road, so they could be with him all the time. It worked pretty well for a while, but then that flew all to pieces too. Bugs and McGraw finally had it at one night on the train, and Bugs was told that the next time he didn't show up would mean the end of his career. Next day we were playing in St. Louis. We were supposed to be at the park at noon, and by 2 o'clock Bugs still hadn't shown up. Finally, we saw Bugs in civilian clothes walking across the field toward the clubhouse, and beyond center field, McGraw met him at the door. "Bugs," he said, "you're through in baseball. Here's your uniform." What was the year we had to buy our uniforms? "See Mr. Foster, and he'll give you a ticket back to New York. You're through with the Giants." When we got back to New York ourselves, hanging in the window of the nearest saloon to the Polo Grounds was Bugs Raymond's uniform with the sign on it, and said, "Bugs Raymond, tending bar here." Raymond, I can't name a single player that I ever saw under the influence of liquor. A lot of those boys were rough and tough, but they weren't heavy drinkers. A few beers now and then, that was about it. I'll tell you something about those players, though, that I think it's usually overlooked. They were rough and tough, all right, but they were good thinkers, too. Players in my day played baseball, but with their brains as much as their brawn. They were intelligent, smart ball players. Why would you had to be? You didn't stay in the big leagues very long in those days unless you saw your head being used every second of every game. You see, it was a different game, and then compared to today, now they're all trying to hit the ball over the fence. It's most brute strength. They're always trying to get a flock of runs at once, But in my day, a home run was a rarity. You couldn't hit balls over the fence in most parks in those days because the ball was too dead. So we were always playing for small scores for 1 or 2 runs. As a result, there was a premium on intelligence in those days, on the ability to outwit and outthink the other team. On speed and strategy, we used heavier, thicker bats and choked up on them so we could bunt more effectively and place our hits. Very few held the bat all the way down at the end the way they do today. The only one I can remember was Frank Schultz with the Chicago Cubs in the famous days of old Tinker to Evers to Chance. Schultz held the bat down at the end, but most of us were choke hitters who punched at the ball, trying to get singles, doubles, not home runs. For example, take a simple thing like the art of getting hit with the ball when you're at that. To get up there with the deliberately attempt to get hit by a pitched ball, it's a lost art today, but not done anymore. I used to lead the league in that. I had baggy uniforms, a baggy shirt, baggy pants, any ball thrown close inside. Why, I turned with it, and half the time I wasn't really hit. Just my uniform was nicked, or the ball might hit your pants close to your hands, and you'd fall down on your belly. And while you're down and trying to make a red spot by squeezing your hand or something, if you had a good red spot there, the umpire might believe it you rather than the ball, and off you go to first base. Of course, in those days, baseball was a pitcher's game and much more than it is today. Not only did we have a dead ball, but pitchers were allowed to use such deliveries as the spitball, the emery ball, and what have you. And we hardly ever saw a new baseball, clean one. If the ball went into the stands and the ushers couldn't get it back from the spectators, only then would the umpire throw out a new one. He'd throw the ball out to the pitcher, who would promptly sidestep it. It would go around the infield once or twice and come back to the pitcher as black as the ace's spades. All the infielders were chewing tobacco or licorice and spitting into their gloves, and they'd give that ball a good going over before it got to the pitcher. Believe me, that dark ball was hard to see coming out of the shadows of the stands. Also, there were a lot of pitchers in those days who were quick delivery artists. You didn't dare step into the batter's box without being ready, because somebody with a quick delivery would have that ball by before you. You knew what happened. That was part of the game. The instant you stepped in the batter's box, you had to be ready. If you were looking to your feet or something, the way they do today to get just the right position and all, well, by the time the ball would already be in the catcher's mitt. Particularly, I remember Pat Flaherty of the Boston Braves and Joe McGinnity of the New York Giants was another of both quick return artists. The catcher would throw them the ball, and bang, right back at it would come. But to get back to the matters of intelligence and thinking in baseball, of what I read in newspapers and books, and baseball all seem in the old days is absolutely 100% wrong. For instance, they seem to think that John McGraw directed every move we made on the field, and that he was an absolute dictator who told us when to do this and when to do that down to the last detail. Well, that's just not so. And it wasn't so for more or other managers either. The fact of the matter is that the thinking and alternates were crucial aspects of baseball then. Most of them were on our own. We used our own judgment. Nowadays, they look at the manager or the coach or directions on almost everything. They aren't permitted to use their own judgment. They are told what to do on every darn pitch. But in our time, we were supposed to know how to play baseball, and were expected to do the right thing at the right time. McGraw allowed an initiative to his men. We stole when we thought we had the jump and when the situation demanded it. We played hit and ran and when we felt we played hit and run when we felt what was called for. We bunted when we thought it was appropriate. Every player on the team was expected to know how to play baseball, and that was the kind of game baseball was in those days. How many games do you see lost today just because they don't know how to bunt? That's a lost art, too. There was a lot of strategy in baseball then, and there isn't very much today. We played a game in which the two key words were think and anticipate. Of course, McGraw took charge sometimes. At certain points in a game, he'd give instructions, but most of the time I'd say the initiative was ours. The player of my day was allowed to think for himself, instead of having somebody to do his thinking for him. Why do you know that we hardly ever had a pregame meeting on the Giants the whole 8 years I was there? Hardly ever. To the day, they always have a meeting before the game to discuss what they're going to do. We didn't need any meetings. Most of us spent all our waking hours talking baseball anyway, so it wouldn't have been silly to have a meeting. Just about the whole meetings that we ever had on the Giants while I was there were to divide up the World Series money. And signs. McGraw hardly ever used signs. The belief that he signaled what was to be done on every play is ridiculous. We were supposed to do things on our own. For instance, we had a base running in club in 1911, 1912, and 1913. We had 6 or 7 men who would each average 40 or stolen bases a season. In 1911, we stole 347 bases as a team. Just the New York Giants, 347 stolen bases in one season. Look it up if you don't believe it. Most of the time we ran on our own. We had signs among ourselves so we could tell each other what we were planning to do. Signs between the batter and a man on base, for instance, but those were our signs. Not McGraw's. Rare occasion McGraw would indeed tell us to steal. Do you know how he'd do it? On his fingers in the deaf and dummy sign language. A deaf-mute dummy Taylor was a pitcher on the club, so all of us knew the sign language. McGraw would sit there on the bench and spell out S-T-E-A-L so plain that anyone in the park who could read deaf and dumb language would know what was happening. We had no complicated signals, a nod of the head or something in the sign language. He might have said, go on, like that, and off you'd go. We could all read and speak the deaf and dumb sign language, because Dummy Taylor took it as an affront if you didn't learn to converse with him. He wanted to be one of us, to be full-fledged member of the team. He went to the vaudeville show. He wanted to know what the joke was. If we went to a vaudeville show, he wanted to know what the joke was, and somebody had to tell him. So we all learned. Practiced all the time. We'd go by elevated train from the hotel to the polo grounds. All during the ride, we'd spell out the advertising signs. Not talking to one another, but sitting there spelling out the advertising messages. Even today, when I pass a billboard, I find myself doing it. Intelligent as they were, most ball players were also superstitious in those days, just as they are today. For the matter, that's an interesting true story about it. That hard to believe, but true. Early in the 1911 season, we were playing in St. Louis, and in those days, neither team had a dugout in the park. We had a bench under an awning about halfway between the grandstand and the foul line. We, the Giants, were having batting practice when we were out on the grandstand, walked a tall, lanky individual in a dark suit wearing a black derby hat. He walked across the grandstand to the bench, and he said he wanted to talk to McGraw. So most of us pointed McGraw out, and we went over to him. He went over to him. Mr. McGraw, he said, my name is Charles Victory Faust. I live over in Kansas, and a few weeks ago I wanted a fortune teller who told me that if I would join the New York Giants and pitch for them, that they would win the pennant. McGraw looked at him and being superstitious, as most ball players were and are. Well, that's interesting, he said. Take off your hat and your coat, and here's a glove. I'll get a catcher's mitt and warm you up, and we'll see what you have. They got up in front of the bench and tossed a few balls back and forth. I'd better give you my signals, Charlie Victory Faust said. So they got their heads together, and he gave McGraw 5 or 6 signals. Mr. McGraw would give him a signal, and he would proceed to wind up. His wind-up was like a windmill. Both arms were around in circles for quite a while before Charlie, he would give the ball and would come up in just the same. There was no difference in his pitches whatsoever, and there was no speed. Probably enough to break a pane of glass, but that was about it. So McGraw finally threw his glove away and caught him barehanded, thinking to himself that this guy must be a nut, and he'd have a little fun with him. How's your hitting? McGraw asked him. Oh, he said, pretty good. Well, McGraw said, we're having batting practice now, so get the bat and go up there. I want to see you run, too. So run it out and see if we can score. Word was quickly passed around to the fellows who were shagging balls in the infield. Charlie Faust dribbled one down to the shortstop, who juggled it a minute as Charlie was running first. Then they deliberately slid him into second, slid him into third, and slid him into home. All this the best Sunday suit to the obvious enjoyment of everyone. Well, the night we left for Chicago, and we got down to the train and to the private Pullman car. Who was there but Charles Victory Faust? Everybody looked at him in amazement. We're taking Charlie along to help us win the pennant, the superstitious Mr. McGraw announced. So believe it or not, every day from that day on, Charlie Victory Faust was in uniform. He warmed up sincerely to pitch that game. He thought to himself he was going to pitch that particular game. Every day this happened. To make a long story shorter, this was 1911, although Charlie Faust warmed up every day to pitch, and he never pitched a game. He wasn't signed to a contract, but John J. McGraw gave him all the money that was necessary. We went to the barber shop almost every day for a massage and a haircut. He had plenty of money to tip the waiters and the small amounts that we tipped in those days. And we did win the pennant. Excuse me. That is good H2O. Anyway. Spring training came around the year Charles Victory Faust appeared in this training camp. He warmed up every day in 1912. Again, we won the pennant. 1913, he was again in the spring training camp. During the season, he continued to warm up every day, pitch. But by that time, he had a tremendous drawing card with the fans who would clamor for McGraw to actually put him in to pitch. Final one day against the Cincinnati Reds, they clamored so hard and so loud for McGraw to put him in to pitch late in the inning. In a late inning, McGraw did send him to the mound. He pitched one full inning without being under contract to the Giants, and he didn't have enough stuff to hit. They didn't score on him. One of those nothing ball pitchers, you know. Well, it was Charlie Faust's turn to come to bat when 3 outs were made, but the Cincinnati team stayed in the field for the 4th out to let Charlie come to bat. And the same thing happened then, and that happened the very first time that Charlie ever came on the field in St. Louis in his Sunday clothes. They slid him into second, third, and home. He was such a drawing card at this point that a theatrical film gave him a contract on Broadway. One of those 6-a-day shows starting in the afternoon and running through the evening. He got $400 a week for it, dressed a baseball uniform, and imitated Ty Cobb and Christy Mathewson, Honus Wagner, in a very ridiculous way, of course. But seriously, as far as Charlie was concerned, fans loved it and wanted to see Charlie on the stage. He was gone 4 days, and we lost 4 ball games. The 5th day, Charlie showed up in the dressing room at the Polo Ground. We all said to him, "Charlie, what are you doing here? What about your theatrical contract?" "Oh," I said, "I've got a pitch today. You fellows need me." So he went out there and warmed up with the windmill warm-up. If he had that tickled the fans, so we won the game. 1913, we won the pennant again. Fall, I joined a group of big leaguers. We made a barnstorming trip starting in Chicago and going through the Northwest down to the coast over to Honolulu. Doing Seattle came. And who came down to the hotel to see me but Charlie Faust? "Snow," he said to me, "I am not very well, but I think if you could prevail on Mr. McGraw to send me to Hot Springs a month before spring training, I could get into shape and help the Giants win another pennant." But unfortunately, that never came to pass, because Charlie Faust died that winter. We did not win the pennant the next year, believe it or not. That's the way it happened. It's a true story from beginning to end. Which reminds me of that other pennant we didn't win, which, as I said before, we should have won. That was in 1908, the year of the famous Merkel incident. Almost 60 years, poor Fred Merkel has been unfairly blamed for losing the pennant for us in 1908. What actually happened was quite understandable, and anyone who puts all the blame on Merkel has to be blind to do a lot of other things that happened that season. Things which contributed just as much as, if not more, to our losing the pennant. Fred Merkel, who had joined the Giants in the fall of 1907 at the age of 18, before I joined the following spring. So in 1908, I met him, and we so called him the Merkel bonehead occurred. He was only 19 years old of what happened. He took more abuse of vituperation with any other 19-year-old I've ever heard of. There were 6 of us youngsters who made the club that year: Fred Merkel, Larry Doyle, Art Fletcher, Buck Herzog, Otis Candrell, and me. Most of us were bench warmers. As a substitute catcher, I was behind a great Roger Brennison, and so I didn't play much. Fred Merkel was the substitute first baseman, and behind Fred Tenney, he was 19 and I was 20. We were both amazed that we were even on the Giants. I doubt if either of us got to play in as many as 25 games that year. Anyway, as soon as the game was over at the Polo Grounds, any game, all of us fellows who were sitting on the bench were in the habit, when the last out was made, of jumping up and running like the dickens for our clubhouse, which was out beyond right center field, and we wanted to get there before the crowd would get on the field. In those days, as soon as the game ended, the Polo Grounds, the ushers would open the gates from the stands to the field, and the people would all pour out and rush at you. Of course, they wanted to do was touch you or congratulate you or maybe cuss you out a bit. But because of that, as soon as the game was over, the bench warmers all made it a practice to sprint from the bench to the clubhouse as far as we could. That was precisely the reason why Fred Merkel got into that awful jam. He was so used to sitting on the bench all during the game, and then at the end of the game, jumping up with the rest of us and taking off as fast as he could for the clubhouse. And on this particular day, he did it force of habit and never gave it a second thought. The famous game in which it all happened took place in New York City, late September of 1908. Of course, the Giants were playing the Chicago Cubs. We were both tied for the league with only a week or two of the season remaining. Merkel was playing first base for us, I think. Fred I think Fred Tenney, the regular first baseman, and was injured for most of the year or something. And this was the very first game Merkel had been put into this starting lineup all season. Mathewson was pitching for us against Jack Pfester, for the Cubs. The game went down to the last half of the ninth inning with the score tied up at 1. Then, in the last of the ninth, the 2 outs, and Moose McCormick on first. Merkel hit a long single to right, and McCormick went to third. Men were on first and third with 2 out. The next man up was Al Bridwell, all on our shortstop. As Al hit a single into center field, McCormick, of course, scored easily from third. He could have walked in with what appeared to be the winning run. Merkel for second base naturally, but the minute he saw the ball was a safe hit, rolling toward the fence out in right center field with McCormick across the plate, the game presumably over by 1. He turned and let it out for the clubhouse, exactly as what he had been doing exactly what he'd been doing all season long. Can't talk today. That was Merkel's downfall, because technically the rules of baseball are that to formally complete the play, he had to touch second base. Bridwell now occupied first. As soon as McCormick crossed the plate, everyone thought the game was over. Everyone except Johnny Evers anyway. The crowd began to come on the field. We bench sitters sprinted out through right center field for our clubhouse, as usual, along with Merkel and everybody else, and the 2 umpires walked toward the dressing room, which was behind the press box and back of home plate. So neither of the umpires saw what happened after that, because they were both going directly opposite from where the ball went. Well, of course, what happened was that the great infield of Steinfeld, Tinker, Evers, and Chance were playing for Chicago, and Johnny Evers, on an old-timer at the game, was the Merkel. That Merkel hadn't touched second and base. Evers began to call the Cubs center fielder, Artie Hoffman, to go and get the ball. Hoffman haven't even chased it yet, because the game was over, and as far as he was concerned. But Evers made so much noise about getting the ball throwing into second base, but Hoffman finally retrieved it and threw it in. However, Joe McGinnity, another old-timer, was coaching at third base for us, and he sensed what was going on. He ran out, intercepted the ball, and threw it up into the left field bleachers. He threw it clear out of the park, and they say Evers got another ball from somewhere else and touched second with it. But I don't think so. I never saw that. And by this time, of course, there were thousands of people milling around the infield. Absolute bedlam around there. And Frank Chance, the Chicago manager, went into the umpire's dressing room and insisted that the umpires, Hank O'Day and Bob Emsley, came out and see what was going on. Chance claimed Evers had gotten the ball and touched second base with it, so that Merkel was out of the game, and should it continued, so a 1-1 tie, and since the field was now total chaos, that the game should be forfeited to Chicago, both because of McNitty. Oh no, we're not even done with this chapter yet. Whoops. Ow. Help me. Interference, and because the Giants couldn't clear their own field, so Chance dragged the umpires out there and said, "Look at this." Saw these thousands of fans on the field arguing, milling around, not knowing what was going on. Complete a pandemonium. Everything was an uproar. Finally, Hank O'Day, who was the senior umpire, ruled that Merkel was indeed out. The third out, therefore, McCormick's run didn't count. that the league was the game ended in a tie 1-1. It was appealed to the highest league levels, but after 3 days of deliberations, they finally upheld their umpires and ruled that it was a tied game and would have to be replayed as a playoff game after the season if necessary. Well, it was necessary. We ended the season and tied for first place with the Cubs, and the game had to be played over to decide the pennant race. As you know, the Cubs beat us in that playoff game, and we didn't win the pennant in 1908. In that famous playoff game, by the way, we tried to get Frank Chance thrown out of the game, but didn't succeed. Even before the game was talked over in the clubhouse, now in the world, all the week. And how in the world were we going to get Chance out of there? Matty was to pitch for us, and Frank always hit Matty pretty well. We felt if we could get him out in some way, we had a better chance of winning the playoff game and the pennant. Besides, we thought the pennant was ours by right anyway. We thought the call on Merkel was a raw deal, and any means of redressing the grievance was legitimate. So it was cooked up that Joe McNitty was to pick a fight with Chance early in the game. They were so knocked down, drag out fight. Chance and McNitty would get thrown out of the game. Of course, we didn't need McNitty, but they needed Chance. Joe did just as he was supposed to do. He called Chance names on some pretext or whatever. Stepped on his toes, pushed him, actually spit on him. But Frank wouldn't fight. He was too smart, and they beat us. With the Chance getting a key hit and three-fingered Brown beating Christy Mathewson. I believe that was the year Brown won 29 games and Matty won 37. It is very unfair to put all the blame on Merkel for losing that pennant in 1908. McGraw never did, and neither did the rest of us. It was mostly the newspapers. They were the ones who invented the term bonehead. How could you blame Merkel when we lost the playoff game? And besides, we lost 5 other games after Merkel incident. If we had won any of those 5 games, we would have won the pennant at the regular season. We would have even have a play-to-play playoff game. We lost a doubleheader to Cincinnati, and then we played the Philadelphia Phillies. Harry Kolovalevsky, who's the next chapter, pitched against us 3 times in 1 week. He pitched against us on Tuesday, Thursday, and Saturday, and beat us all 3 times. That's when he acquired his nickname Giant Killer. Harry, he had us beating us 3 times in 1 week, surely wasn't Merkel's fault. And do you know that we ran Harry clear out of the league the next season? It was the craziest, most foolish thing that ever happened. And McGraw was told by a friend of us who had managed Kolovalevsky in the minor leagues before he came up to Philadelphia that Kolovalevsky always carried some bologna in his back pocket and chewed it on the bologna throughout the game, and that he did this more or less secretly. Maybe somewhat ashamed of his habit. It was sort of an obsession with him. So this manager told McGraw, and McGraw saw it to it that some of us players would always meet Kolovalevsky as he was going to in from the pitcher's box whenever he pitched against us. We stopped him and say, "Hello, hey, give us a chew of that bologna, will you?" Well, this so upset the fellow that he couldn't pitch against us to save his life. Never beat us again. Word got around the league that the other clubs started doing the same thing. It chased him right back to the minors, or at least that's what we Giants have always claimed. Often when the Merkel bonehead is recalled in the next breath, they talk about Snodgrass, 30,000 muff. I've had to live with it for years. Oh yes, you're the guy that dropped the fly ball in the World Series, aren't you? I never lost that World Series. I never took the blame for losing any World Series. I was terribly incensed a few years ago when a book on baseball facts and history came out. A friend of mine said to me, "Have you seen the book?" I said that I hadn't. "Well," he said, "you better get a copy that they have a section in there on the World Series, heroes and goats, and you're listed as the GOAT in the 1912 World Series." So I got a hold of a copy and read it, and it said that in the 1912 World Series, the Red Sox vs. Giants, in the 10th inning of the last game, Fred Snodgrass, the center fielder of the Giants, dropped an easy fly ball and let the tying and winning run score, and thereby I lost the game for the Giants. I did drop a fly ball, there's no doubt about that, but I didn't let the tying and winning run score. I couldn't very well because it happened the first man and up in the bottom of the 10th inning. It was the 8th and last game of the series. One game had ended in a tie, and the score again was tied up at 1 at the end of the regulation 9 innings. In the top of the 10th inning, we scored a run on a hit by Fred Merkle. By the way, we went into the bottom of the 10th inning. Matt Eddy pitched in one-run lead. He couldn't have held that at one-run lead. We would have won the World Series. First man up for Boston in the bottom of the 10th inning was Clyde Engel, who was pinch hitting for Smokey Joe Wood. He hit a great big glazy high fly ball between Red Murray in left field and me. Murray called for it, but as center field, I had reference over left and right, so there'd never be a collision. I yelled that I'd take it and waved Murray off, and well, I dropped the darn thing. It was so high that Engel was sitting on second base before I could get back to the infield. Harry Hooper was the next batter in 10th inning of the tie game. In the last game of the World Series, we were just as certain that he would bunt to move the man over to third. My position in center field was fairly close and behind second. Matty was holding Engel close to second so that we could get him to third on the bunt. I was in pretty close, figuring that if Matty threw to second and the ball got by second in any way, I could still keep Engel from going to third. But instead of bunting, Hooper cracked a drive way over my head, and I made one of the greatest plays of my life on it, catching the ball over my shoulder while on the dead run out in deep center field. They always forget about that play, and when they write about the inning, and in fact, I almost doubled Engel at second base. He was turning in third when I caught the ball. He thought it was gone, and that play at second was very close. So that's one out. Then Matty called Steve Yerkes walked Steve Yerkes, unfortunately, with what proved to be the winning run. 2 men on and only 1 out, and up comes Tris Speaker, one of the greatest hitters in the game. The crowd was making so much noise it was deafening. What does Speaker do but take a swing at the ball and hit a nice easy pop fly and a foul ball near first base. Suddenly the crowd was so quiet you could even hear a pin drop, and that the ball was never touched. Merkle didn't have to go 30 feet to get it. It was almost in the first base coaching box. Chief Myers, our catcher, tried to catch it but couldn't quite get there. It was too far from the home plate. Matty couldn't have put it in his behind pocket himself. But no one ever touched it. Given the reprieve, Speaker hit a clean line drive over the first baseman's head that scored the man. And I put Yerkes on third base. Another long fly to right by Larry Gardner. The Yerkes scored after the catch. The game is over, and according to the newspapers, Fred Snodgrass lost the World Series. I did drop that fly ball, and that did put that what turned out to be the tying run on base, but that's a long way from losing the World Series. However, the facts didn't seem to matter. Oh, those were stormy days. I always seemed to be getting involved in hassles of one and sort of another. Like the time they claimed I spiked home run Baker. Oh, my God. That was a 1911 World Series when we were playing Connie Mack's Philadelphia Ace. In fact, that was the series in which Frank Baker acquired his famous nickname of Home Run Baker. He hit 2 home runs against us in that World Series, and in those days, those were extraordinary performances. Before the series began, we had been told by friends that Baker was spike shy, that he'd give out of your way at third base if the occasion arose. But to the start at the beginning in the 1905 World Series, the 6 years before the Giants beat the A's 4-1, that was the series in which Matty had shut out the A's 3 times, and Joe McNitty had shut them out once. In that series, the Giants had been dressed in black broadcloth uniforms. So superstitious, and he was superstitious. He ordered new black broadcloth uniforms for the 1911 series. We went out on the field all dressed up in black, and as we sat on the bench waiting for the Athletics to walk past us to get the visiting team's bench, we all had a shoe off in one hand and a file in the other. We were all busily sharpening our spikes. We figured that might have some effect on them because they were a base running club, and we wanted them to get the idea that they'd better get out of their way. Or we better get out of our way. As I said, we stole 347 bases that season. Well, I happened to be the first man in that game to get at the second base who had occasion to try and get to third. Chief Bender, oh my goodness, these are the last 2 pages, for the A's, and throwing his beautiful curve into the dirt, and the catcher was having trouble digging it out. One pitch got away from the catcher, and I let for third base. But Baker knew that we had been told that he was a spike shy, and he had just guts enough to try to block me off the base. So he was down on one knee in front of the bag with the ball waiting for me to slide. Well, I couldn't hook the bag in or out because he'd ride me right off, so all I could do was go hard into him, try to upset him, which I did, and I was safe. In doing so, I cut his pants from his knees clear to his hip. They went and got another pair of pants and a blanket, put the new pants on him, right at third base, and the game proceeded. Well, same play happened again a few days later. I'm on second, a pass ball, and I took off for third. This time I was out, and I ripped his pants again, plus a little abrasion on his leg. Not a cut, no blood, nothing like that. Oh, I was the dirtiest player in baseball. Newspaper stories told how I jumped as Baker waist high, which wasn't true at all, and how I deliberately spiked him. Why was I ever roasted? They built it up until Baker's bones showed from the knee to the tip. In fact, a news report went out to that some fanatic had shot Snodgrass in the hotel. It was reported that I had been taken out to the hospital in critical condition. They didn't have radio then, and that story went out over the wires. My parents out here in California heard that I had been killed, and it was several hours before a retraction came out, and they found out I was all right. And then there was the crazy incident in Boston where Mary Curley tried to have thrown me out of a game. That was in 1914, the year of the Boston Braves miracle team, which came from last place on July 4th to beat us over the pennant. We had been leading the league all season, but the Braves made this wonderful climb up the ladder from the last place until Labor Day, and playing against the Giants, they had a chance to pass up us and get into the first place. The crowd that wanted to get the ballpark in Boston that day was greater than the seating capacity as they started putting spectators in the outfield. In fact, Boston Braves borrowed Fenway Park from the Red Sox that day because the Braves' own park was too small to hold the crowd. They put ropes in the outfield, and thousands of people were sitting and standing behind the ropes right on the playing field. They were standing right behind my back in center field. We had a big inning in about 6th or 7th inning and scored 4 runs to go well ahead of Boston. I came up to bat after we'd scored all the runs, with nobody on base and 2 men out. George Tyler, who was pitching for the Braves, was pretty disgusted by then. He took it out for me and by aiming 4 shots straight at my head. I hit the dirt 4 times, and the 4th one hit the bottom of my cap. So on my way to first base, I went by the pitcher's box. I stood in front of that guy and called him everything I could have think of. He never said a word. Finally, when I ran out of ejectives, I went over to first base. Meanwhile, the huge crowd was hooting and hissing and booing at me and making a terrific din. They knew they weren't going to get into first place that day, and they were pretty sore about it. Well, I got to first base. Tyler looked over at me and tossed the ball into the air and dropped it, a pantomime of the fact that 2 years before I had dropped the fly ball in the World Series. Crowd just loved that. Hooting and booing got even louder. If that was possible, the next man and made the third out. I started out for my position in center field as I approached the crowd behind the ropes out there, booing and yelling at me. I just thumbed my nose at the whole bunch of them, just an old-fashioned nose thumbing to let them know I was out. I thought of them. Well, that really set them off. It was a signal for all the pop bottles and trash of any kind that people had come flying out on the field in my general direction. That place was an uproar. Just then, a fellow jumped out of his box seat near the home dugout and marched into the field accompanied by a couple of high-helmeted policemen. He had on a long-tailed coat, spats on a top hat. He paraded over to the umpires. It was the Honorable James M. Curley of the mayor of Boston. He said I had insulted the good citizens of Boston and demanded that I'd be removed from the field immediately. It was just before election time. He was making what you might call a grandstand play for votes. After a big argument, Bill Clinton, who was umpiring, chased him off the field, and the game was finally finished without further trouble. But you can bet I didn't play a very deep center field the rest of the game. They tell me that after the last out was made in the ninth inning, I ran in from center field so that I was easily the first one over to the dugout. Well, life has been good to me since I left baseball. My lovely wife, Josephine, and I have enjoyed success. Things have gone well, very well, through these many years. Contrast my years in baseball, their ups and downs, their strifes and their torment. But the years I look back at most fondly, those I like most to live over, are the years when I played center field for the New York Giants. This chapter is finally over.